So you've been in the trade, the antiques trade, for over 40 years now. How did you get into that? Was that something you had to train for at school, or did you have to go to university? I mean, or were you just passionate as a kid about antiques? How did you get into it?
It was none of those things really. I fell into it. I'd left school, I was out of work, and my father came home one day and said they're looking for someone at the local auction room to fill in. And my parents were desperate for me to get a job, any job. So I went along on what was initially a 6-month contract, and I was still at the same company over 40 years later. No, I never had any interest in antiques. How did I learn about it? Just hands-on, really. It's not a trade that you can learn about in college or university, although courses have been tried out over the years, primarily at Southampton back in the 90s. But they don't really work because they don't teach you what you need to learn. They teach you very highbrow stuff rather than just the everyday bits that you're going to see when you start working in an auction room. So no, I fell into it and I learnt on the job.
Well, you obviously impressed them to stay there for so long.
I guess so. Never really occurred to me. I guess I did. I don't know how, but yeah, it was obviously an interesting job. You get people will often say to me, "Oh, I wish I did your job." But let's be honest, every job just becomes a job after a while, and you take it for granted. And perhaps I shouldn't have taken it for granted. Perhaps I should have realised that yes, I'm seeing something very different every day, and it's been a pleasure to work in this trade.
So what is a valuer? What is it you do? Is it like when you see Antiques Roadshow and they people take in their really high prized antiques and they're worth thousands of pounds a lot of the time? I mean, what is it you do on a day-to-day kind of basis?
Well, if I answer that in two ways really. When I was working in an auction room, we would have our valuation days where people would bring things in. I think the difference between myself and a valuer on the Antiques Roadshow, for example, is that they're specialists. So they will have somebody, if you took a painting in, they have their painting specialist to look at it. And indeed, that would even be split down. They might have a 20th century art specialist, 18th century English art specialist, etc., etc. Whereas the way I learnt on the job, I would have to be able to value anything. And if I didn't know for sure what it was worth, then you'd have to be honest and explain to people, need to do a bit of research on this and go from there. So that was when I was working in an auction room. But today, I'm working as a freelance valuer, mainly doing valuations for probate or insurance or such like. So it's a little bit different. I'll go into a house and I'll have to value the contents of the house, whether they be modern effects or indeed full of fine antiques. It's a little bit different what I do now to what I did when I was at an auction room.
What is probate?
Now there's a question. Unless you've been unfortunate enough to have been faced with having to organise a probate valuation, I can quite understand why you would ask that question. I say unfortunate because people who are asked to organise probate valuations are unfortunately the executor of a deceased estate. So it means somebody close to you has passed away. Now, the current inheritance tax threshold is £325,000, and anything over that figure within your deceased estate is liable to inheritance tax. So in other words, the house might be worth £325,000. Therefore, everything else that is owned is liable to tax. So it's important, particularly in estates that clearly are worth quite a lot, for customers or for executors to get somebody like me in to value the goods within the estate. It's very, very easy to look at a house full of furniture and goods and think, well, there's nothing here of any value. I don't really need to get a probate valuation done. But the fact of the matter is, often it's a piece that you least expect that's valuable, sitting in the corner that you think's worth pennies, can be worth thousands of pounds. And that, of course, raises the value of the estate, which means that you are or the estate is liable to inheritance tax. It would be very easy to think to yourself, well, we just won't mention that thing in a corner that's worth a lot of money. But it can come back to bite you on the bottom if you try and do that. So it's very, very important to cross the T's and dot the I's and get it all right, shall we say.
Can you define an antique? Because for me, if I go into an antiques shop in a small town or something, it just looks full of junk. And I imagine antiques to be lovely, expensive vases, furniture, oil paintings. But these days it seems to be like it's just anything that's kind of looks a bit tatty. Like, can you define
anything a bit old? Yeah.
Can you define antique? And does antique mean valuable necessarily?
Not at all. The strict definition of antique, when I was coming up through the trade, basically was 50 years old. Even though, let's look at it when I started. Let's say in 1980, therefore something that was made in 1929, 1930 was deemed antique. Even though we in the trade didn't necessarily view it as antique, you're quite right. What most people think of as antique, what they think of, is a fine grandfather clock, a great big Chinese vase that you see in a stately home and things like that. But that's what we view as antiques. The true definition really is 50 years old. So of course that means today in 2020, if you're looking at something made in 1970, that Urkel light elm room divider, which is highly prized because it's a classic of modern design, is in fact an antique, just as much as an 18th century grandfather clock is.
So maybe any person over the age of 50 could be described as an antique.
Yeah, that makes me an antique, doesn't it? Thank you very much.
So what's your house like? I imagine it's full of antiques and collectibles. Does it look like an antique shop on the inside?
Far from it. I think any job, there are people in that work within the world of antiques that are avid, passionate collectors. So of course they have their fields they collect, and they live and breathe antiques and collectibles. I've never really been like that. I appreciate antiques. I appreciate different strands of the collecting world, but I'm much more of a material person. I'd much rather spend my money on a nice new three-piece suite than I would on a grandfather clock, for instance.
There's nothing you collect?
I collect records, believe it or not. So, although some of my records predate 1970, so they could be called antiques, but no, I used to poo-poo people when they collected modern design or mid-century, which is the great term today. I used to poo-poo people for that because I could remember it when all these things were worthless back in the late 70s, 80s. But of course now that is the thriving area of the antiques and collectibles market, is this mid-century modern design. I now have come round to appreciating that, I have to say. It's nostalgia driven. You remember these things as a child, so you want them in your house today. So I like modern design. I collect records and rock and pop memorabilia, I guess, that sort of thing. But antiques, nah, no good robbing my house, believe you me.
Onto eBay now, the online auction site. If you're selling something through eBay, how do you know which kind of price to start something at? If you're a total novice like myself, if I had something, how do you gauge what a good starting price is?
Well, firstly, if we just touch on the fact that is eBay a good medium to sell antiques, it's probably not. It's very, very useful for some things, minor collectibles, shall we say, and this is if a private individual was selling it, rather than a dealer. Dealers will use it and they'll sell things of high value on there, and that they will fix it at the figure they would have it on in their shop, for instance, and just see if somebody picks up on it online. But for the average man on the street or woman on the street, to sell things on eBay. It's rather difficult because the obvious thing you do is have a look and see what similar things are priced at. But of course the buy it now scenario on eBay is entirely meaningless, because it doesn't mean you're going to get that figure if you put a buy it now price on. That's like a retail figure in a shop. So yes, you can use existing things on eBay to get an idea for what you might get for something, but the only true measure is to strike out all the buy it nows, look at the sold listings and see what things have actually sold for, and then base it on that. But what I would say, eBay is just the same as any other auction. It's very, very wise to use a come and get me reserve or starting price. If you've seen something sell for £50 on eBay, it's no good going in and putting it with a starting price of £50 just because one has already made £50. The idea would be, you've seen one make £50, you hope that yours might make £50, so start it at £20. It's a case of drawing the bidder in.
What's the most unusual thing you've ever valued?
Do you know, that's quite a common question. I've been asked that many times before, and of course in a long career there are probably dozens of unusual things, but off the top of my head I'll say, just going back probably 15 to 20 years ago, a customer brought in what just looked like a ragged old book, an album if you like. I think it was actually a late Victorian ledger or bookkeeping book. And I opened it and I could see that pasted into this book from start to finish was letters, handwritten letters. Now this isn't unusual. Just ordinary people would have often collected letters that they'd received over the years. But it became clear after having a little look through it that there were some quite famous names had sent these letters. So it was a case I had to sit down and read through the entire book, which is quite difficult because handwriting sometimes is completely illegible. Sometimes it's beautifully clear, sometimes it's completely illegible. So the recipient of these letters was a fellow called Mark Whitwill, who was I was based in the Bristol area at the time, was a Bristol businessman who was also a great charity donor in the late 19th and early 20th century. And all of these letters were replies that he had got from people that he had asked for donations to his charitable trusts. So we had names in there, I can't remember them all now, it's many years ago, but we had names like Thomas Edison. We had, he had several letters from members of the suffragette movement that these were people that he had tried to help when they were in prison. So we had letters from prison from some members of the suffragette movement. There were several well-known poets of the age. So it's just a fascinating thing, and it took me a long, as you can imagine, it was a good inch thick, this book, and it took me a long time to work them all out. And we made the decision that some of these letters should come out of the album because they were important signatures on the letters in their own right. So we took a few of the signatures out. I guess we probably took maybe 10 or 15 out, sold the rest as a book. And I think they total somewhere around about £6,000 or £7,000. Right. But interesting, and certainly not something you can see every day, because it was a one-off without precedent, as we say.
Nice. So it must be quite interesting when things like that come up. So you never know what you're going to get on a day-to-day basis. You
never know what you're going to get, whether it be in my old working environment where you get people bringing things in all day for a few days, those set valuation days. You just never know what's going to come out of somebody's bag or what's in the back of the car when you open the car up. And today, of course, with my speciality being probate valuations, you never know what you're going to find when you go into a house to value the entire contents. I've had a few very interesting ones there, for instance.
Want to divulge?
One of the last full probate valuations I did before moving to Norfolk and going freelance was a property in Weston-super-Mare, where I had been told by the solicitor dealing with the estate that we feel we should fumigate the house before you go in, which sets the alarm bells ringing a little bit. But I said to her, look, however bad it is, I'll have seen worse. I've seen some horror stories, but that's for another day. So I went to the house, and actually it was fine. It was just full, very, very full. And by full, I mean you'd go into a room and it was waist high in bags and papers, and you couldn't see what was in the room. So I went into the lounge, fought my way through everything, and I could see sticking out from the top of a pile of blankets and bags and boxes and this, that and the other, a bronze figure. But it was at such a level that it was clearly part of a piece of furniture. So I spent 20 minutes pulling everything away from this thing, and bit by bit what emerged was a very important Italian ebonized cabinet, embellished with micro-mosaic panels and agates and semi-precious stones inset into it. An astonishing piece of furniture, almost museum standard furniture, in a nondescript flat in Weston-super-Mare. As I went through the house, I was finding other things of astonishing quality. And it turned out that the lady who had passed away and had lived like this for some years, it turned out that she had 4 or 5 generations back had been from a very, very wealthy, moneyed family with country estates, etc. And this was the residue of the estate. But as it happened, she had been living in this small flat in Weston-super-Mare for 60 or 70 years. Just amazing. You just don't know what you're going to get. And the irony there is, the previous house I've been to, there were 2 houses in Weston-super-Mare. Lower Weston-super-Mare, I go into the house to do a probate valuation, and there was literally nothing of value, nothing at all. The first time in my entire life that I have actually written to the solicitor and said the value of this, the contents value for probate purposes is 0. The first time it had ever happened. And then I drove 2 miles up the road to this house, and I get that. So yeah, you never know. You never know.
And finally, to end the interview, what in 2020 should we be collecting or keeping an eye out for when we're going through those charity shops and antique shops and?
Well, it's always difficult, because if I knew that 100%, I'd be buying it all, wouldn't I, and stockpiling it. So you can only use my professional intuition and say that don't look for modern design and mid-century, because everywhere it's overpriced. People overprice it. It's very rare that you're going to find a cheap bit of modern design. I think the obvious thing to say is buy when the market's low, stockpile it, and then sell when the market starts to revive. So there are many things that are absolutely rock bottom. One of which I'm sure the majority of people really wouldn't want to collect, but it's not a bad thing to buy, is Royal Dalton figures and things like this, which literally, I mean, they're dreadful little things. They're crinoline ladies and this sort of thing.
You're not a fan.
I'm not a fan at all. Everybody's grandmother was a fan, but today they're very outdated. But they are ridiculously cheap compared to what they were 10 or 15 years ago. The average price for a Royal Dalton figure in the 1990s was probably £35 to £45. This is for basic models. There are ones that are worth high hundreds, even thousands, and they will remain worth that. I'm talking about those basic ones that were £35, £40. You can buy them for £5 or £10 now. So buy those, fill boxes full of Dalton figures, put them in the loft, hope the market revives, bring them out in 10 years' time, and you never know, you might make a fortune.
Thank you, Mark Fraser, for having a beer with me.
You're more than welcome.